I'm going to talk about continuous provision today. I'm also going to talk about enhanced provision, the difference between the two, and why they're so important. So if we take the concept of provision itself, the reason we have this terminology has come through quite a few different research projects, but basically it boils down to us as grown-ups, as leaders, practitioners, working with young children, providing physical spaces for children to access resources in order to play. And we accept that children learn through playing. Now, the debate around play and learning doesn't really center on something being better than the other, but what we recognize from children who we observe in their home environment, on the street, in the parks, we recognize that children play naturally. And so what we want to do is use that natural play behavior as a doorway into teaching. And so when we say continuous provision, what we're really talking about here is, say, like a set of shelves, some resources on those shelves, perhaps a table or a tough spot tray, or perhaps just some activity for them to engage in and for them to deepen their learning. Some settings have what we'd call completely provision based, which is where the children come in at the beginning of the session or the beginning of the day. They access those resources continuously, and the adults will float around the children, having conversations, teaching new things whilst they're playing with the children. And then the end of the day approaches, they might have to say a story, say goodbye to the children, the parents will pick them up, and off they go. Some settings might have a slightly more adult-led or focused approach, where perhaps what they'll have is little pockets of play during the day, which works just as effectively. So you might have children coming in first thing in the morning. They might have, say, half an hour to play, and they might go and do something like register. They might do some kind of maths input. You might have the children sat at tables to do something for a little time, and then you let them go and access the play provision. When we do that, what we want to do is make sure that our play provision reflects the kind of learning we've been teaching formally on a table or at the front of the class, and so we can deepen their learning even more. We don't want to see play provision as just a break from the real learning. It is real learning, and there's an opportunity missed if we don't do something with that. So I'm not necessarily going to say one's better than the other, but as I talk through, you'll be able to pick out what will be relevant based on what you do at the moment. If you don't have any provision, really it's up to you how you want to introduce it, and I will talk a little bit of that as we go through. In general, people will have things like a sand area, a water area, a maths provision area. They might even have a writing or a reading area, maybe a book corner or a story. And there isn't really a hard and fast set of rules about what you have to have available. In general, in England, we tend to see provision areas that tend to reflect the curriculum areas that we have. So we have 7 curriculum areas. We generally will have like a maths area, some things linked to English, whether it's reading or writing. We might have construction, so a building and block area. But everything else is kind of left open. We do have things like a role play area, like a home corner, that's really important. But other people have different things. I also wouldn't necessarily suggest to you that there are certain things that you absolutely have to have in each of those different areas, but I will talk about how you decide yourself. So if you followed me on social media, you will know that I talk in depth about this concept of culture and of play diet. And I'm not referring, when I say culture, I don't mean things like cultural activities. I don't mean, going to the theatre or dancing. I also am not referring to how we live in different cultural bubbles around the world. I'm not necessarily referring to that. What I'm referring to here is the culture of your immediate environment. And it's made up of lots of different things. So your children, when they come to you, they bring their interests, their knowledge, the knowledge of their homes and their families. They bring their likes. They may have been on holiday to see grandma. They'll bring that to them as well, to your provision as well. They might bring other things as well. Perhaps they have different learning styles. Perhaps they have disabilities or, difficulties speaking. We also have our parents as part of our culture, and our parents have expectations about what our children will be learning in our environments. And so if you have parents who want their children to be writing their name, well, it's something that we have to recognize and consider. It's something that they want them to be doing. We also need to consider our staff and think very carefully about how our staff bring unique things to the environment when it comes to designing provision. So for example, you might have staff members who have a particular interest in something. So my background I grew up in a household where we grew our own fruit and veg, which is relatively uncommon now in England. Um, so we tended to um, do things like, my family would grow some potatoes and some things, over the whole year, but we'd also grow things like strawberries and fast growing salads and things. When I started teaching, I was teaching a group of children who didn't know where their food came from. They would often have things like packets of crisps or chips. They would eat food from containers and packets, and they wouldn't see food being cooked from scratch. And if they did see food cooked from scratch, they didn't see where that came from. They didn't grow their own food. And it was something that I found very difficult to see. And so, as a staff member, as a grown up, I realized that my passion for growing could be introduced to my provision. So we established a garden, we grew our own fruit and veg, which was very uncommon for the place that I was actually teaching in England. It was a city centre and space was a premium. So any space we had to grow things, we really needed to make most of it. So we've got our children, we've got our staff, and we've got parents, but we also need to consider our physical space as well. So you might have a very, very small learning environment. And so when it comes to having provision, so access for children to do that free play, they may not actually have, or you may not have a huge space to create it. So you might only have a corner, you might only have that back wall, or you might even only have space outside. And that's absolutely fine. We've got to work with that. We can't build a new building just to let the children play in necessarily. We've just got to work with what we have. Then we also need to think about our immediate sort of environment around us. Do children have access to everyday experiences? Do children go to the shop? And something that's quite common in the UK is that children will either go to a shop and mum or dad will pay using a bank card, so they don't actually pay with cash anymore. Or they might go to like a self-service checkout, so there's no person there and they just scan your own items and you disappear. Or parents are buying things on Amazon and they just get delivered, and then children never see the shop experience. And so we need to remember that. We need to think very carefully about what are children really bringing to the setting. If we want children to role play and to present, pretend they're in a shop, buy some things from you, put it in a bag, give them a receipt. If they've never experienced that in their real lives, how are they able to bring that to their everyday play? And so instead, why don't we think about their real experiences that they have that they can bring to the play with them? There's a big issue in the UK at the moment of lots of local shops disappearing. So, for example, post offices are disappearing really fast, local corner shops are disappearing, banks are disappearing, and it's simply because everything's either moving online or people are becoming more centralized, and so sort of village and towns are losing things to the big cities. And so lots of our children now don't really experience any of these what I considered normal activities. Growing up, we would go to there'd be a man selling fruit and veg. Anything we didn't grow, we'd buy from him. If we wanted to get some things from the post office, we would. None of those things are available for our children. And so it's just really important to remember what they bring with them to the setting. And the final thing is to consider the community that you serve and how there are many aspects, many wonderful things happening in your community that you want to bring into your setting, that you want to celebrate. Do your children shop in particular shops? Do they have exposure to certain brands? If they do, and you're creating, for example, say a little kitchen for them to cook things in, well, the brands that you've got available, are they things that they're familiar with from home? And this leads me into the idea of play diet. Now, play diet's a really big thing for me at the moment because, and I'm not sure what it's like around the rest. Well, I know what it's like in, say, Australia, because I have some people I work with over there, but around the world, I think we're very influenced by things like the Reggio Emilia approach. We're very influenced by the look and the aesthetic, the feel of an environment, but we're not necessarily always creating provision that truly reflects our children, what they have at home. So, when I was growing up as a little boy, I had a huge garden to play in. It was wonderful. But my toys inside were hand-me-downs. I'm the youngest of 5 children, so I didn't get any new toys as a child. It was always things my brothers and sister had played with. So I was really used to things like Lego. I had lots of little action men. I had a battleship. I had some dinosaurs. And when I went to school and to my nursery, I had those things to play with there as well. resources to hand in lots of different ways that are really open-ended, that can bring them together like sticks and stones and then create things with them. Beautiful. But if your environment doesn't have things that they're familiar with, we are not necessarily working with what we'd call their play diet. We're rubbing up against it. We've got children who are at home playing with these wonderful things, but when they come into the setting, to your classroom or to your provision areas, they don't know what to do with these things. It's something that's removed from what they're used to playing with every single day. And so it's a really important consideration of how or what we choose. We need to really think about, what do our children play with at home? What kind of things do they engage in? And can I easily replicate those in my classrooms or in my provision areas? It might be starting really simply by having something like a kitchen in the corner of your classroom. And by kitchen, I mean things like make believe kitchen. So it's it's a smaller unit, but you might choose to have like old appliances that are they're broken. You cut the plugs off, you can stick them in the corner, like an old microwave or an old kettle. Things that might be familiar to them from their own homes, and they can play with what they know. And you can still introduce new things to them. So you might introduce like a new appliance, or you might introduce a range of spoons, or something that's a little bit different. And the power for these, the importance of these, is they're developing their fine motor control, they're developing their language, because you might say, actually, these spoons are wooden. Can you see they're different? What can you tell me about it? They might use some new vocabulary, like say slotted spoon or ladle or tongs, all these different words that perhaps they might not be exposed to if we're just focusing on learning happening at a desk, because these things happen in the moment. And that's the power and the benefit. As grown-ups, we need to be part of that process. We need to be in there and spending time with the children, which isn't always the easiest thing to do. So if you've only got one member of staff in your room, probably you, and you're at the front of the room and you're teaching, and you've sent a group of children off to play in the provision area, you can't necessarily be there to work with the children. And that's fine. That sometimes happens. In which case, you design your provision, you put resources out that are familiar, but also, and maybe a little bit challenging, maybe something that's a little bit different that they've not seen before, that the other children might talk about with their friends. It's up to you how you want to manage that. It's a good idea if you can be released into the provision to spend a bit of time playing alongside the children and talking to them and giving them that new vocabulary, but it doesn't always work out. It's not always possible. And a final point I'll mention before I actually sort of go to questions, I want to talk about loose parts play. So this is my big area. This is my big love and passion. You might have heard the term loose parts play being used. It simply means children can pick up an object, a random object like a stick or a stone or a shell, and turn it into something else. I cannot tell you the amount of times children have picked up a stick and turned it into a sword or a magic wand or even a gun sometimes. And I know we're careful about superhero and weapon play, but actually, if a child knows what a gun is, they might turn that into a gun. And we've all done it as children. We've all gone outside and used something and played with it and turned it into something else that we didn't necessarily want, it wasn't designed to be. That can be a really powerful way to introduce provision to your space, because then you don't have to go out and buy loads of resources. You can just use what's already available. In fact, there's a huge argument to suggest that you should be using everyday items for loose parts play. So for example, in the UK, I suggest we use things like sticks and stones and shells, because they are usually part of most classrooms anyway, but also things like bottle tops, so plastic bottle tops, drinking straws, if we've got any left, although they're banned now in the UK, but I still have some, don't tell anyone. We also might bring in things that are just what we'd call maybe like trash, basically, but clean and appropriate. Maybe boxes and I call it masking tape. I'm not sure if that translates very well. Masking tape is it's like just regular tape, but it comes off really easy. Use it for decorating. Really simple everyday things that they've seen before, that they know about, that they can use creatively, that they can use to create things. And it opens up the doorway to creative play. A consideration for loose parts play is that whilst it can be really creative, it does come back to, if children are not used to this kind of play, then we need to spend a little bit of time modeling it to them. So if you've got children who are coming to you who've never been allowed to go outside in their garden and build or create something using, sticks and stones and leaves and things from their garden, well, when they come to you and you have those things available, they might look at them and think, I don't think I'm meant to touch those. I often call it Granny's house or a museum because those things are there to be looked at but not touched. Well, in that case, we would then need to spend some time modeling that we can do things. Some settings that are a little bit more formal, potentially, let's say, older classrooms, might choose to set challenges in those areas, such as, can you build me a house with all of the loose parts resources? Can you build me, I don't know, the three bears from the Goldilocks story? Can you build me a castle? But whatever challenge you set, it can come from the curriculum as well. So if you're already teaching children about, like, say, homes around the world, you would perhaps set the challenge linked to that. Alternatively, what you could do is using any kind of downtime in your day, such as break times or lunch times, or even before or after school or setting time, you could play alongside the children with those resources just for a couple of minutes, just to demonstrate the kind of play that they can use them for. It's not the easiest of thing to get going. And the thing about loose parts play is often people will become despondent if not all of the children get involved with loose parts play straight away. But you have to remember, if children are not used to this kind of play, if they are at home looking at iPads or watching TV or spending their time on YouTube, and again, I'm not criticizing those things, but if that's all they do, then they're not going to be able to engage in loose parts creative play easily without some support, without being sort of, I don't want to say model to, but sort of immersed in that environment. My background working in the cities in the UK means that for the most part, a lot of the children I've taught have been, we call them from deprived communities. And I don't think that's a fair assumption because actually a lot of the time they have wonderful experiences, but they don't tend to play a lot. A lot of the parents will push them down the route of quite academic reading, writing, counting work, even from a very early age. And so my task as a teacher has been to sit with those children and to support them in that kind of play. I want to leave the last few minutes of the session over to some questions. So, guys, if you want to use the chat function, you're more than welcome to. If you'd like to turn your cameras and mics on, or just your mics on to ask me any questions, please do so, because I appreciate I've tried to pitch that at quite a simple level, but I very much appreciate I've not been to your settings. I'd love to come to Nigeria, by the way, if you want to invite me, but I've not been into your classroom, so I don't know what's available to hand. Has anyone got any questions, any comments, quandaries? Whilst you're typing away, if you have any, I have put on a video on my YouTube channel. It's called Creating Your Culture, which better breaks down what I talked about at the beginning of this video, where we look at the different areas that make up curriculum. And so, as it make up culture. And so it's free to look at. Please do have a little watch of that. Through my social media, I also delve into this quite a lot, but it depends where you are in terms of your journey towards continuous provision. I'd love to know if anyone has continuous provision in place and maybe some of the hurdles have sort of come up against, through their implementation, really. I'll give you a minute to type if you want to type something. If you haven't got any questions, in terms of implementing this to begin with, like I said, I would start with something very simple, like a home corner. But if that even if that seems too big to you and it's a bit scary, start simply with a box or a basket of some of these loose parts resources. And if the reason I say in a box or a basket is because it's transportable and you can take it outside at break time if you want to, or it can be put into different parts of your space, and it can open up the doorway for that sort of concept of continuous play. And then from having the box, you might find you bring more resources in. You might even have a shelving unit or bigger resources. You can take some pictures if you want to of the actual sort of what they've created, if that helps. Or you can just maybe write down some notes about what they've created and have that available on display in your space. Okay. Any questions, anyone? Lovely, thank you. So yes, I'll try that loose parts in a basket. Definitely pick things that are familiar to the children to begin with. Don't put too many things out that are a bit unusual, because children pass through that period of exploration. They'll want to pick it up and touch it and feel it and smell it and listen to it, and might even want to put it in their mouths depending on the stage of their development. Um, you want to have things that are available that they know really well. Otherwise, if they'll all, sort of jump in and want to grab things, and it'll get a bit much. You introduce those new things slowly. Oh, so what items are suitable for loose parts for 3-year-olds? So 3-year-olds, because most 3-year-olds are moving out of the oral sort of age range for resources, you can usually start to have things that are a little bit smaller. But the first consideration always has to be, are the children going to be safe with these resources? So a rule of thumb, or rather a rule of hand, is, for me, never use an item that's smaller than this part of their hand. So if you've got a 3-year-old, grab their hand when you see them next, find out how big that is. That tells you, because the point is, this is sort of the size their throat can expand to. So anything smaller than this is going to get caught quite easily. Okay, so bigger than their hand. There are certain rules about under twos. If you do have under twos, I appreciate it's a different country, but it's even more important to have bigger items. So for 3-year-olds, we'd start with those recyclable things. So your bottle tops, your straws, but also things like sticks and stones, things that you can find when you go outside where you live, things that they know really well, things that they may have already used for play. You might then also want to bring in some other natural treasures. So you can usually buy online, if you want to, some like seed pods and things. In fact, I won't lie, guys, most of the things that I've used over the years have come from different parts around, sort of basically around the equator. So they should be a little bit easier to get for you guys. Beyond that, some of the typical things that you might already have in a school-based environment might work as well. So, things like cotton reels, things like maths counters that are quite colourful and bright, those can be used for open-ended play. You've already got them. You don't need to go and buy some new things. Use what you've got. And if you don't want to use them, send them to me, because I'm constantly going through bins when people throw them out and say, these are really valuable still. These are real things that children can use, and they're really important. What they're made out of isn't really a massive consideration for most children. I sort of struggle with adults who may consider loose parts maybe junk. Okay, if that's the case, it will be a good idea for you, if possible, and I appreciate it's very common over here for people not to have printers. So if you can take a photograph of play that's happening with loose parts play and show the adults, either on a device if you've got it, on the camera, or if you can print it or put it on a website or social media, whatever you can manage to do, try to capture some of that play, and then say to the grown-up, I know it looks like rubbish, but listen, she was saying this is just like that castle that I've seen on the TV, and he was saying it's just like that house down his street. They had a conversation about it. They learnt about all these different buildings. They started talking a little bit about different materials, and it can really become something much bigger. So it's really about capturing the learning to share with others and not worrying too much about what it looks like. Okay, I'm going to wrap it up there, everybody. Visuals, thanks. If you've got any, in all honesty, send me a message on social media and I can try and capture what other people have done in the past. Some people have books and things